Right now, somewhere on this planet, there's an animal that has no idea what's coming. It's hunting, foraging, doing exactly what its species has done for 100,000 years. It doesn't know that a few thousand years from now, one of its descendants is going to be curled up on a couch, wearing a tiny sweater with a name tag. Because that's the pattern. Give humans enough time with a wild species, and eventually someone looks at it and sees potential. Not danger. Potential. Think about the auroch. 6 feet at the shoulder. Horns built for goring. An animal that could kill a person without slowing down. Somebody looked at that and thought, future breakfast. That animal became the cow. Here's what most people get wrong, though. They think domestication is finished, a closed chapter. Something that happened once a long time ago, and now we just maintain what already exists. That's not true. It's still happening. Right now, today. There are species on this planet mid-transformation, and most of them don't even know it. But before predicting what's next, you need to understand what the word actually means. Because domesticated and tame get used like synonyms, and they are not the same thing at all. A tame animal is an individual, one creature that has learned through exposure and patience to tolerate a human. You can tame a tiger. People have tamed crocodiles. There's a man in Russia who raised a bear from a cub, and that bear now sits on the couch and watches television with him. That bear is tame. That bear is not domesticated. Domestication isn't about one animal. It's about a bloodline, a trait that gets locked into the genetics of an entire population, generation after generation, until the population itself is a different thing than its wild ancestors. Smaller skulls, softer faces, different brains, different hormones, different instincts. The clearest proof of this came from an experiment that nobody expected to work as fast as it did. In the 1950s, a Soviet geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev started breeding silver foxes using exactly one rule. Only the calmest, friendliest individuals got to reproduce. No other trait mattered. Not size, not color, just friendliness. Within a handful of generations, something strange happened. The foxes weren't just calmer, they looked different. Floppy ears appeared. Tails curled. Coats developed patches of white. They started barking. They started craving human attention, the way a dog does. Nobody selected for any of that. It came along for free, wired into the same biology as friendliness itself. So, what actually makes an animal a candidate? It needs to breed in captivity without a fight. It needs a diet flexible enough to survive on what humans can realistically provide. It needs real variation in temperament, individuals calmer than the rest of their species, something to build on. And it needs a social structure a human can slot into, a hierarchy already built for one member to lead. Keep those 4 criteria in mind, because some very unexpected animals are already checking every box. Start with the fox, because it's the animal already closest to crossing the line, and not just because of Belyaev's lab. Urban fox populations, completely on their own, are shifting. City foxes measure less afraid of people than their rural cousins. They're bolder, sharper at reading human body language. Nobody bred them for it. Cities did. Add a few generations of intentional selection to that head start, and you'd likely have a domesticated fox faster than any other candidate on this list. In a sense, it's already applying. Now for the one that surprises people. The crow. Birds have been domesticated before, obviously. Chickens, ducks, pigeons. But crows aren't following that path. They're carving a different one. And the reason is unsettling intelligence. Crows recognize individual human faces and remember them for years. They hold grudges against people who've wronged them. They've been documented leaving small gifts, buttons, foil, bits of glass, for the humans who feed them regularly. Parents teach their young which specific people to trust and which to avoid, passing that knowledge down like a family story. And in cities, something is already forming. Crows know garbage collection schedules. They've learned to drop nuts into traffic so car tires crack the shells, then wait at the exact point in the crosswalk where the nut lands, but the tire won't crush it. That's not instinct. That's problem-solving aimed at human infrastructure. The obstacle is that crows don't have the built-in hierarchy that made wolves and horses so easy to fold a human into. But they do form loyal, long-term partnerships. Whether careful breeding could deepen that bond into dependence is genuinely an open question, and current evidence leans toward yes. Then there's an animal the internet has already fallen in love with without realizing it's basically pre-approved. The capybara. They're the largest rodents alive, and almost everything about them lines up with what a domestication checklist wants. Deeply social, constant communication within the group, calm around humans when raised near them, grass eaters, which is about as low maintenance as a diet gets. They're famous online for one specific behavior, sitting motionless while birds, monkeys, and other animals climb on them like furniture. That's not passivity. That's an animal with an unusually high tolerance threshold, exactly the trait every domestication story starts with. Their one real obstacle is water. Capybaras are semi-aquatic and need regular access to it, which complicates things logistically. But strip that away and the raw ingredients, temperament, sociability, diet, captive breeding are already sitting there. Run a dedicated breeding program selecting for human affinity, and a recognizably domesticated capybara population within 100 generations isn't a stretch. In evolutionary terms, that's barely any time at all. Now for the candidate that's going to make people uncomfortable, the octopus. Stay with that for a second, because the instinct is to dismiss it immediately. No fur, no warmth, no face that reads as friendly. 8 arms, 3 hearts, blue blood. A nervous system spread through its own limbs. It looks like it belongs on a different planet. But domestication was never really about cuteness. Most domesticated species in history weren't companions first, they were food. Cows, pigs, chickens, sheep. Affection came later, if it came at all, and octopus farming is already underway. Global demand for octopus meat has outpaced what wild fisheries can supply, and research institutions, particularly in Spain, have spent years working to close the full life cycle in captivity, breeding, hatching, and raising multiple generations without pulling from the wild. Here's the part that changes the conversation. Octopuses have individual personalities. Researchers who work with them report real behavioral variation between individuals. Some shy, some bold, some visibly irritated by specific people, to the point of aiming water jets at researchers they don't like. That's exactly the kind of variation a selective breeding program needs to work with. The obstacles are steep. Most octopus species live only a year or two. They're solitary, often cannibalistic, which makes group housing genuinely dangerous, and they're famous for escaping enclosures that seem completely sealed. But the underlying criteria, flexible diet, captive breeding, measurable temperament differences are all technically present. Nobody's pet octopus is coming soon. But not impossible is where every domestication story on this list actually began. Back to something more familiar, the deer. Reindeer, the same species as caribou, have been managed and selectively bred by Arctic peoples for thousands of years. Not fully domesticated in the way cattle are, but well past the wild end of the spectrum. Meanwhile, white-tailed deer living in suburban neighborhoods are visibly less fearful of people than their rural relatives, and they've started associating human spaces directly with food. Farmed red and fallow deer already exist commercially, with breeding infrastructure already built. Their obstacle is biological timing. They're seasonal breeders locked to day length, which limits year-round management, and they carry antlers, which complicate handling. Even so, of every species on this list, deer may be furthest along the practical path toward full agricultural domestication. And then there's the elephant, which complicates the story in a different way entirely. Elephants have worked alongside humans for thousands of years in war, labor, ceremony. But almost every working elephant in that history was captured wild, then broken through a process that had nothing to do with domestication and everything to do with force. That's taming at an industrial scale, not genetic change. A genuinely domesticated elephant population, genetically distinct from wild elephants through generations of captive breeding, doesn't really exist yet. The potential is enormous. Elephants are highly intelligent, deeply social, capable of forming real bonds with specific humans. But the math is brutal. 15 years to sexual maturity, a 22-month pregnancy, the longest of any land mammal. A breeding program aimed at true domestication wouldn't take generations. It would take centuries just to get enough generational turnover to see genetic change. Some researchers argue it may already be starting, quietly, in the long-established captive populations of Myanmar and Thailand. If so, it would be the slowest domestication event in human history, unfolding on a timescale almost too long to observe in a single lifetime. Step back for a second because there's a deeper question sitting underneath all of this. Why does domestication keep happening at all? Food and labor explain the start of it, but they don't explain why the pattern never stops. Here's something that rarely comes up in this conversation. You might be a domesticated species too. Researchers studying human evolution have noticed that modern humans show physical changes eerily similar to Belyaev's foxes compared to earlier hominins. Softer brow ridges, smaller, flatter faces, reduced physical aggression compared to our ancestors. It's called the self-domestication hypothesis, and the idea is that as human groups began punishing overly aggressive individuals and rewarding cooperative ones, our own species may have selected itself toward calmness the same way Belyaev selected his foxes, just without a lab, over tens of thousands of years. There's a wild population that supports this same idea in a completely different species. Bonobos and chimpanzees split from a common ancestor, but bonobos evolved in an environment with less competition for food. Compared to chimps, bonobos are less aggressive, more socially tolerant, and physically more pedomorphic. Rounder faces, traits that persist into adulthood. Nobody bred them. Their environment did the selecting, the same passive pressure that's shaping city foxes and urban crows right now. Domestication, in other words, might not be a special process humans invented. It might just be what happens when a population gets rewarded for tolerance over time, whether or not a human is running the program. And the changes don't stop with the animal. The species doing the domesticating changes too. There's a study on dogs and their owners that captures this directly. Researchers measured hormone levels in both species during eye contact and found that when a dog and its owner hold a mutual gaze, oxytocin, the same hormone tied to parent-infant bonding, rises in both of them. Not just the dog, the human too. That's not a metaphor for connection. That's a measurable physical loop, evolution shaping both species around the same relationship. The auroch didn't just become a cow. The humans who domesticated it built the agricultural systems that made permanent settlements, and eventually cities, possible. Every domestication event in history has quietly rewritten both species involved. So if crows become common household animals a century from now, what does that do to how city dwellers relate to wildlife? If octopus farming scales up, does recognizing individual personalities in the animals we're breeding create ethical obligations nobody's prepared for? These aren't side questions. They're the actual heart of what domestication has always been. There's one last candidate almost nobody talks about, and it's the strangest one on this list because it isn't a new species at all. It's the wolf. Not dogs. Wolves again. There's a small but serious body of research looking at specific wolf populations, isolated groups that have lived near human settlements for generations, and asking whether they're undergoing a second independent domestication event, not the one that produced dogs tens of thousands of years ago. A new one happening now, in specific places. In areas where wolves have learned to tolerate nearby humans rather than flee, the wolves that stay calm and hang back near settlements survive and reproduce more successfully than the ones that don't. That's passive selection, quietly running in the background, exactly the mechanism that likely produced dogs in the first place. Not a deliberate breeding program, just bolder, calmer wolves outlasting the reactive ones generation after generation, until one day a human decides one of them can come inside. If that's true, then domestication was never a single historical event. It's a force that keeps switching on wherever a species and a human settlement sit close enough, long enough. Which means the real answer to what animal will humans domesticate next might be simpler than anyone expects. Probably all of them, eventually. The ones that can adapt, the ones already standing at the edge of a human settlement right now, watching and not running away.